on, everyone? Preston, Stewart, and Sarah Payne with War Stories, joined today by Ian Richardson, coughing during the intro. What's going on, man?
Lovely. Hey, everybody.
Thanks for doing this, man. So we talked with Ian. We talked like a week or two before Russia invaded Ukraine. It was right there on the line, and it was a cool episode. I liked it because it was like a little backstory. Maybe I'm getting these mixed up. We talked a couple times back to back, but anyways. You've got a lot of history, a lot of knowledge in the Cold War that really is coming in handy, I think, in this conflict. But anyways, we briefly chatted the other day. I didn't know that you were kind of involved in, what's the right way to say it, teaching it, talking about the conflict?
It's kind of, I was doing enough talking about it at work. I work, first things first, government employee, work for the Patton Museum, also in the Army. Nothing I say here espouses the opinions of the United States Department of Defense, nor the Center for Military History. So you put that out there right now. These are all my personal opinions. But talking enough at work and having some friends out in the force, that the active force, that knew I had kind of a focus on this stuff. It started because back after the war started, I had a lot of people coming to me and asking me details and talking to me about things that were going on. Want to know things about the Russians, want to know things about the Ukrainians, the basis of the conflict. And one day, my buddy, I was going down to Fort Benning for work, and a buddy of mine worked in one of the basic training battalions there. And he basically was like, hey man, I know you've got a bunch of current modern Russian equipment and stuff. Would you like to come down here and talk to my battalion? And they're all these infantry guys mostly, because I guess it's all OSIT. But he's like, hey, come down here if you want to. I'd love for you to bring a bunch of your kit and talk to these guys, the Russian Army, current threats, small level stuff, small arms,
that's cool,
tactics, things like that. So it started with that informal thing for my buddy, and I brought all my kit down there and visited with him and talked to him at Benning. Turned out his battalion commander is also like first generation Ukrainian, has relatives like over there fighting right now. Really nice guy. But went down there and did that, and I was really happy with the way it went. And so, being at the museum, the curator at the museum and I are really proactive. We do a lot at the museum now even though it's the Patton Museum, we've shifted in recent years to be more focused in leadership training and development. Our big focus now is we're also kind of the official like ROTC kind of museum, because the cadet command is based at Fort Knox. And so we do a lot of Patton history, but we use leadership principles from his life and kind of stories from that. And we do a lot of talking about junior leadership, captain and below sort of stuff. And I apologize, I'm getting over bad allergies. So what we did was we started building these little programs to teach second lieutenants and cadets that come through every summer, because from about May to August every year at Knox, you've got 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 cadets coming through for their advanced camp, their third year. And they no longer do it out at Washington. Every program goes out there in the summer now. For you, Sarah, you at least understand the reference there. I know you probably went on to Washington, I'm guessing.
I went out to Washington. Yep. I think
was it LDAC back then?
LDAC 07. Yep.
Yeah.
So I really liked it being from Ohio rather than Fort Knox. I'm right, like 2 hours away. So to go to see Mount Rainier and everything, that was pretty cool.
I think it was maybe like 8, 9 years ago, they shifted everything. Once Cadet Command went from Fort Monroe to Knox, they just said, screw it, we're downsizing anyway. And so now everything happens at Knox. And so they do basic camp there. They do what used to be LDAC advanced camp. And so because of that, we always had lieutenants cycling through the museum. And we have all these different LPDs we put together, leadership development training. And my curator goes, well, hey man, why don't you put something together for the modern Russians? Even if it's not really official or anything, he's like, I'm sure the cadets will get a kick out of it and they'll love it. So I've done a few of those now. And what I did was essentially I built a program and a slide deck with just kind of base knowledge, trying to like give people an explanation like, hey, here is a basic cultural and technical analysis of the current Russian military, their soldiers. And I wanted to kind of give people a bit of a background so they weren't just going like, dirty commies, or like, I wanted them to like kind of have an understanding like, look, this is a country that has a long history. There's a lot of stuff that plays into what's going on now. And that was kind of my focus, with a little bit of talk of like soldier gear and like the more sexy stuff that kind of keeps their attention sometimes too.
That's pretty cool. I'm glad you asked that question, Preston, because I had no idea. Because I don't know if you've even put it together, but you're like, your day job is with the museum, but you're training like both sides of the coin, like the infantry enlisted person and the officer side of things. It's like both of those. So that's pretty cool.
It's a fun experience. It's great too, because we get these like small teams of second lieutenants every year that come in and work at the museum and they volunteer to work with us. And generally we give them the option to volunteer early on when they come through in their rotation. We're like, hey, anybody who wants to come to the museum and help us out, let us know. And generally they don't understand that like, if they don't come to work with us or like voluntarily, they're going to put on a whole bunch of crappy details like all summer. And like, we try to tell them like, hey, foot stamp on the floor, like, hey, this may not be the most fun. If you come to us, we'll at least give you something fun to do. So our lieutenants ended up cleaning out an M3 Lee tank for like a week and a half, which they loved. It was great. We just happened to get a new armored vehicle and it was a good time.
What are some of the what are the general thoughts of these cadets or lieutenants coming in when you're talking about this stuff? Like, how do they feel about the war? What's their base knowledge about the war? Anything you can summarize?
Well, it kind of depends on the kid. I find there's two different types of cadets and lieutenants. There are ones who are like super into it. I've gotten more than I've ever expected. I've gotten a lot of like Eastern European studies focused kids, like a handful, but like more than I ever thought I would see. And I've gotten several that are actually like either somewhat knowledgeable on the language or already fluent speakers. It's weird.
In Russian?
Yeah, Russian.
Yeah,
or
nobody's
one that knew Ukrainian because he was Ukrainian.
I was going to say I don't think you can take Ukrainian in college right now, right?
No, although if there's ever been a time to take Ukrainian, I wouldn't be shocked if we saw a few programs pop up here and there.
Sure.
But no, it generally ends up being like, I'm not really interested at all. I'm just in the Army and I'm trying to figure out what the Army is right now. Or there's kids who are like, oh my God, yeah. Like, and they come up to me and they're like, oh, what do you know about like this body armor versus this body armor, like this caliber? Do you know about the AK-12 versus the AK-74? And I'm like, look, man, I can go into that detail, but I'm here for everybody. But I tell them like, if you got any more questions, talk to me afterward, et cetera. Kind of thing. But, no, a lot of them are really excited, really into it. And I think it's weird too, because I'm having to like I have another LPD I do that's about like the history of OPFOR and like the history of like how the Army trains people for an opposing force and aggressor. And that kind of dovetails in with like, we're in this phase right now, right? It's pretty obvious that we're getting out of the GWAT and we're kind of now going back to this force on force idea, similar to the Cold War. And I think it's interesting to see because so many of us, and especially our age, have been raised in this GWAT era where we're thinking coin and we're trying to transition ourselves where they're just like, oh yeah, Russians are the bad guys. Got it. Like that's so very much, it's starting to become kind of part and parcel with training now, which is hard to kind of wrap my brain around. But I'm trying to give them a good walk-in of that and kind of get them used to the idea of, these guys are an adversary again. Here's why. Here's what you should probably know about their country if you're going to have to learn anything about them. And especially if you're going to Europe, because more than ever, most of those kids are not going to go to Iraq. They're definitely not going to Afghanistan. They're probably not going to go to Syria. But there's a high likelihood they will go to Germany. They will probably go somewhere in Poland. That's the new, or in the Pacific. And those are the new front lines.
One of my go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to say our old units in Poland, but either way, that Cold War thing, it's been a long time. Like because it's been, the Cold War ended, let's say in the 80s for the most part. So the 90s sure had the legacy, but I still think we were all kids in the 90s. I viewed Russians as bad guys in the movies more so than I did in real life. Yeah. And I still think it was more of the Middle Eastern sort of tribal warlord sort of fighting with Black Hawk Down. And I know Kosovo happened. I know I didn't really understand much of that in middle school whenever that happened. But like my own little kid sentiment was, I don't know if counterinsurgency was what I was thinking, but that sort of fighting, or maybe like Vietnam, like even, some not peer on peer sort of things. And but the Cold War, that legacy, we were still sort of in it at the same time when we deployed. We were a heavy weapons company. Well, those heavy weapons companies were outfitted to take out tanks and armor personnel, but we obviously weren't being
Humvees
used
with
that
toes
way.
on 'em.
Yeah, exactly. Old school. And that was what the manual said, which means the manual doesn't work and we just have to make it up. We have to figure it out on our own and apply it, because that is what we were designed for, and that's not how we were being used. But I also remember, like in 07, when I did do the LDAC thing, right after that, that summer, I went to shadow at Fort Riley, Kansas, and it was like an armor infantry battalion. But anyway, I was in HHC, and the scouts guy, the scouts platoon sergeant, who was like E7 and 07. So he's pretty old school. We've been around for a while, definitely came up in the 90s. He was still all about that. Like, he had this skill set, and all those scouts did, because they were armor scouts, like he could take a test and have all of the tanks or all the armored vehicles, the Russian, the Soviet ones. He knew all of them from like silhouette type stuff, because he still sort of came up in that era as well. So it's like, it's always lingered, I think, within us. But at the same time, 80s were 40 years ago.
Yeah, no, everything, everything old is new, right? Like, that's why you've got guys like I was telling you about the other day, Preston, like Lester Grau. I'm pretty sure Lester is like close to like 76, 77, but he is still the Army's premier resource for DIA on Russian stuff. Like, the guy could have retired 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and he's still around because that guy is a subject matter expert. He was a FAO, a foreign area officer based on the Russians, and he's still heavily involved in Department of Intelligence and like Russian analysis and stuff. He's written most of our books, or he's a co-author in most of our doctrine based around the Russians. Like that, you stick around long enough, everything you know about is going to become new again. And like, and the other thing is, I think what helped was, through the 90s, especially with Yugoslavia and Kosovo and stuff, we still had a little bit of that near peer thing. We didn't feel we were on, near peers with Serbia or whatever, but it paid to know the vehicle identification, the force on force stuff, because that came in handy with Serbia, with Croatia, with all these sub forces and Bosnia and stuff that were there, because they had that equipment. That's a lot of what Yugoslavia had. But it's interesting, you talk about like when we were kids, like thinking about, especially early GWAT, and I'm a few years younger than you guys, but not so much that we didn't have shared experiences culturally. And like, it's weird because the Middle East and this idea, especially the post 9/11 idea of COIN and anti-terrorism and stuff, it's so amorphous, right? It's like easy to make a bad guy when you just say, oh, it's a guy in a man dress in the watch out. Like that was
IED facilitator.
Right. It's so, yeah, IED facilitator. Like,
the hell does that mean?
Bomb factory in this building, you got to go clear the bomb factory.
That means he has a shovel, is all that means.
Yeah, it's a guy with a weapon-looking object in his arms, But it's like, it's weird because that is easier, especially in the post-Cold War world, than the idea of just, here is a whole nation state. They are bad, we are good. It's the dynamic. We're trying to rotate back to this, but at the same time, this isn't the Reagan era anymore. Like, it's really hard, and I think this is a good thing. It's really hard to get the general public to just be like, other than maybe people who are around the Cold War era. And this is what I struggle with. It's like, there are a lot of a certain generation, it's very easy for them to fall back into old patterns of like, oh, those dang commies, they're coming back again. Guess we got to wallop them once more. Like it's a whole country, yes, but it's a government. It's not a people. Like, there's a difference there. And that's what I always have to preface my talks with, is like, look, I want you guys to walk away understanding that there's a shared history that Russia and the Soviet Union have. This plays into why their army is the way it is, why they fight the way they do. I want to give people a historical and cultural background to explain why the Russians behave the way they do what they do, why they are built the way they are. And I don't want people walking out of my talks and stuff just going, oh, those darn Russians, like they're just another army like anybody else. I'm just here to facilitate you understanding their structure and why they do what they do.
That's something I've thought a lot about recently, and where I feel like generally speaking, kind of the bite-sized news is a lot of like rah rah, beat up on the dumb Russians, and it highlights everything that's gone wrong, because there's been a lot of things that have gone wrong, especially, you know, I don't know what the Russian expectations were. I imagine it's not right. I imagine it wasn't this, but who knows? Maybe their expectations were substantially below what we placed on them, for reference. But there are a lot of things to point at and say, what in God's name is happening here? But it does seem like that is the overwhelming. That's mostly what we get shown, right? Like there's also things they do that are very tactically and operationally sound. That doesn't make the front page of Reddit or the top page of Reddit. Something that's been on my mind is the underestimating of a potential adversary, because we get so focused on, kill those dang commies. Are we downplaying a legitimate potential threat?
Are we taking their agency away, kind of?
Yeah. Like, I don't know. The thing I've said before is, like, if we thought they were an 8 or a 9, they're probably not that, but that doesn't mean they're a 1 or a 2. Like,
right.
They're still a capable force, still a deadly force. I don't know. It's not really a question. A little bit of me is concerned that we're making them out to be nothing.
And I think so. Part of that comes from that ingrained culture, especially here in the West and in the United States in particular. We have a tendency to try to fall back into old practice, into Cold War, us versus them, and we have this tendency to also just fall back in and say, oh, it's just like 40 years ago, same thing. They're exactly the same military. Well, they're not. There's been 30 years, an economic collapse, a couple different governments. There's a lot of stuff that's happened. They've also got some military experience since then. Arguably, the Russian Federation has more combat experience really now than they did in their history from World War II to Afghanistan. They put down a couple revolutions, but think about it. In 30 years, you've got Chechnya, you've got Chechnya again, you've got Georgia, you've got Syria. And when you think about all that stuff kind of over broadly, like, they're covering all sorts of different operations. You've got counterinsurgency, you've got force on force, you've got straight up just, occupation, you've got basic ground land invasion with Georgia. So they are experienced. But there is a tendency for us to kind of fall in it. And I think another thing too, and this is what I struggle with too, is that there seems to be, especially when you're talking to normal people or people that aren't following this a lot, there's a really thin line between trying to explain to someone what may actually be happening versus telling someone what they don't want to hear. Like, hey, like, this is actually kind of how the Russians are planning these things. This is a tactically sound decision they made here. And there's a thin line between sounding like an apologist and being contrarian, I guess. Like, that's what I struggle with, because I'm fascinated by this stuff. I also have some friends that I'm in some chat groups with, and we talk about things as they go on, and they're very knowledgeable on this stuff. But for whatever reason, they really, really like they really don't like the idea that the West continues to push a lot of narratives about Ukraine being successful when they may have not been as successful as we may think, or opinions differ. And for whatever reason, these people I know and respect just refuse to believe that the Russians are doing as badly as they are. And I'm like, look, man, I understand you can be interested in this stuff and not make it like you don't have a dog in this fight, man. You don't live there. There is nothing lost in you saying the Russians are doing badly. Like, I understand and respect the Russian Federation's military and how it works, but that doesn't mean I have to be a sympathizer. That's the tough thing. It's drawing that line between understanding them and wanting to know the truth, and sometimes having to counter our own Western biases because they're very much the bad guy in this scenario. And that's the thing I always say. I always tell people when I do my presentations too, like, do not at any point mistake what I'm talking to you about right now as an excuse or trying to be a sympathizer with the Russians. They are the bad guys. They invaded. This is their war that they started. However, here are some things, like,
That's a good
Yeah.
point. There's a difference between providing an excuse or excusing and an explanation. And holy cow, especially in the no face, internet, it's easy to mix those two up. But
Yep.
just because something has an explanation doesn't mean that it's excusable.
Right. And yeah, it's really easy for people to get outraged online, and it's just kind of how things go. And the other thing is too, is history, as anybody who studies it knows, everything is a shade of gray, right? This one, the thing is nothing is black and white, everything's a shade of gray. This one sure seems to be a real dark shade of gray, but it's still in the spectrum. It's a shade of gray, right? It's how I'm trying to explain to people, like, how the Russian army works, why it's built the way it is, but at the same time, there is no, misunderstanding that the offensive on Kiev didn't work out. They just got kicked out of roughly 6,000 to 7,000 square kilometers of land up in Kharkiv. The Russians are not doing so hot on the ground. And then you got people going like, well, they're taking, like, the Ukrainians are taking all sorts of casualties. I'm like, well, I'm sure they are, but any way you slice it, they took back a whole lot of land, man. Like, that's more than the Russians have taken in the last 5 months. That's tactically, no matter how you slice it, that's a good job. It's a victory. It came at a cost, but it's a victory. Like, I understand when people want to counter a narrative or a bias that we have inherently, and I understand that we have biases in the West. Especially we have biases because we're funding the Ukrainians. Of course we're biased, but that doesn't mean that you can't ignore overarching truths, like the Russians failing in various ways tactically on the ground, and a need for them to, have these referenda that people have been calling since before the invasion. We're going to go this way, and as of probably tomorrow, I'm willing to bet I think the referendum closed tomorrow, and I'm sure it's all going to end up being miraculously 95% of the population somehow came out to vote, partially at gunpoint by some reports, and they're going to all vote to join Russia, and then they're going to sign a piece of paper, and a whole bunch of other stuff might happen. There are core truths you can't ignore, no matter what side you're on. But you can't let that get in the way of trying to have a clear gray understanding of the conflict.
I think, to me, this is a hill I'm definitely willing to die on, in the sense of, like, everybody has a right to an opinion and the ability to share it freely, right? As long as those opinions aren't to incur violence upon another, as long as we don't act violently upon those thoughts. But, like, when freedom of religion literally means I can believe in any fairy godmother, any tale that I want to, that you can't see, you can't touch. This is a story that it's bound by faith, which is unprovable. That's why it's a religion and not science, I think, in my opinion. But the whole point of that is, as long as you're not bothering anybody with those thoughts and expressions, it's not a problem. And what I mean by that is people that are afraid to tell the truth as they know it, I think is just a big problem. Because if somebody thinks that, let's say, flat earth is the truth, they really believe that, and that is their thought, and they're afraid of sharing it, I feel like in the inside, they might just double down. They might get resentful at that. But in let's say a society where, like, I can freely express it, and then you can freely express why I'm wrong, let's say, and over time, I might change my mind. You might change your mind. And I also think that is the same thing with, let's say, the Russia situation. I think that we're in a favorable position, because when the truth telling that you're talking about, I don't think Putin's in a place where he's got truth tellers as the actual doers of the job. And I think history and time again will show, because you said history repeats itself. When old becomes new, that's another way of saying that. And anytime we have a despot in charge that doesn't listen, they will go a distance, but not the distance, when they don't have the truth from bottom up refinement, essentially. Like, imagine another situation where Hitler listened, or where people weren't afraid to tell Hitler the truth. And he was just like, kind of like a Julius Caesar type person, like who Julius Caesar committed genocide too, right? He did that to the Celts. That's a Dan Carlin I listened to anyway. But Julius Caesar did listen to the bottom up. And just conquered the literal world with that sort of refinement. People weren't afraid of speaking their mind around him, as I understand that situation. And so that is way more threatening, which means you're actually more efficient and effective when you have people telling you unpleasant news, and the phrase that I've always sort of regurgitated since learning it in the Army is bad news does not get better in time. And I would hate to see us, to me, that's what separates United States is we say it out loud. We just, what's on our mind, we're supposed to say it out loud. That is what sort of separates us. We've got freedom of the press, all this, and it's discourse and it's uncomfortable and it creates conflict and nobody likes having to go through that. It makes your stomach hurt. But that's kind of a lot of things in life that are sort of worth doing. They're not supposed to be comfortable, but then you get through it at the end and you realize sunlight is the best disinfectant. So,
well, we're also in a unique place right now, of course, right? Because we're outside the conflict. We may be funding one side very heavily, but we can easily sit back here on our laurels and be like, oh, yeah, that's happening. Because we're not. And I understand where a lot of Ukrainians are coming from. I have friends who would sometimes in our chat groups, they'd be like, geez, look at this, super nationalistic, very, very, very ignorant post from someone Ukrainian that we might know that said something very, very nationalistic, whatever. I'm like, guys, here's the thing. That's very easy for us to sit back. And this goes back kind of into the social media thing. It's very easy for us to sit back and go like, oh, geez, look how loud and obnoxious these ultra-nationalist Ukrainians or ultra-nationalist Russians are. But we don't have multiple relatives on the front lines dying. Like, I understand the emotions. I try not to judge them. I understand if someone says something very ignorant. I run in some groups where I see some really ignorant stuff from Ukrainians that is like, oh, I want to piss on the graves of all these Russians and da. And I understand the vitriol because I can sit here. I am safe. I know in my suburban home, nothing wrong is going to happen to me. That person, their judgment is colored by the fact that they have probably seen much death, already lost friends and family. And I try not to judge them for that because it's for them, it is truly existential. And I understand that they have a right to be mad. They didn't invade Russia. Russia invaded them.
Right.
And the death and destruction that's wrought has been tough. And it's, I get it. I do. I just try to stay out of it.
Is this comparing this? I don't know if this is the best comparison, but I've seen a lot online when you talk World War II, there's a lot of debates that devolve into who was worse, the Japanese during World War II or the Germans, and then somebody will throw in the Soviets who, fair point, in different ways, but like, how do you compare those? Like, how do you compare one atrocity to the next? How do you compare one form of genocide to the next? Like, you can't, I don't know. My personal opinion is that's not something you can compare. So when you start grabbing, like, I saw a TikTok of a guy was in a Ukrainian military uniform doing the goose stepping Nazi stuff in the woods recently. So it was during this conflict. Like, I have no idea if that's taken out of context, if it's made up, I have no idea. But for every one of those, you're going to find something in Russia that a mistreatment of prisoners or nationalistic there. And like, you can, go tit for tat nonstop. It doesn't make either one better or worse. Just like, that's a rabbit hole.
And that's kind of what I've had to tell some people. They're like, oh, well, there are literal Nazis in Ukraine. I'm like, yeah, there's literal Nazis in the United States. That doesn't give Mexico the right to invade us,
Right.
Like I've tried to put it on an even keel for us. It's like, look, I get it. There's bad in every society, but that doesn't give that nation a pass to just invade you. Like, it's not how that works. And when you dig into it, and if you know anything about a lot of the culture and a lot of the people that are contract soldiers in the Russian army, there are a lot of there's quite the ultra nationalist, white supremacist Nazi movement within the Russian army too. And there's been a lot of that popping up in some channels that I've seen. Like, it's bizarre because there are some literal Nazis in both sides. But at the end of the day, I go, look, Ukraine was invaded by Russia. Any way you splice it, I don't care what you say. Nothing. Even if Russia's claims are, oh, the government is all Nazis and we have to go purge them. That was their government, not your government. They can go be whatever the hell they want. If they're not attacking you, don't fucking invade them. Like it's
There's-
hard. And that gets out of the academic side of things too, and which is where I
we're starting
try to
find out.
stay in the academic side of things, but it's tough.
I'm going to bring it back then. So there's this joke saying in World War I, pre-World War I into World War II, that the Russians take forever to mobilize, right? That's part of the reason that the Schlieffen Plan would work in World War I, is like Germany can take care of France before Russia even figures out what's going on. Then again in World War II, after Barbarossa, they like all the signs were there. They just were so slow to really mobilize as what we know now as the Red Army of 1945, right? 1943, 44, 45, especially at Stalingrad, where they just said kind of enough's enough and just started pushing back. It took a while. This is different. And I don't think it's in a lot of ways. But do you think there's anything to that historic piece of Russia taking a long time to kind of, for lack of better terms, get in the war mode?
Here's the thing. All those previous things were in an era before social media and before large opinion. Now you take social media out of the equation. The big thing is here, this is not existential to Russia. Nothing in Russia has been invaded. There is no one in Russia going, oh, look, my house was invaded by Ukrainians and now we have to respond. There is a historic precedent of them taking forever to mobilize. But the other thing is that, I think I remembered mentioning this in that podcast we did right before the invasion. They've had a head start on this. One of the big indicators was and this, in retrospect, of course, everything's 2020, but they started what's called the BARS system, and you've probably seen it mentioned a few times. I don't know, but the BARS system basically was the Russian. Okay, I got to go explain some other stuff now. So first of all, until very recently, the Russian Federation does not have what we consider a traditional reserve. We think of reserve, we think of active drilling reserve, guys who, do their weekend and their 2 weeks in the summer, weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer. And they are actively training and keeping abreast of their skills, right? And a lot of them may be former active duty, but they are actively drilling and doing that throughout the year.
They still have uniforms.
They still have uniforms. They still go in and train on weapons at least once a year, that kind of thing. Russia did not have that until about late fall of last year. They started a program called BARS 2021, and essentially what that is it's a armed forces reserve, a proper active armed forces reserve that trains as a pool of mobilization people. Prior to that, that's what's so confusing about this whole partial mobilization thing that started recently, is that traditionally the Russian reserve is just guys who did their now 1 year required conscription, and they're basically kept on a roster. They know they have their name, they can say they had combat experience, but in most cases they don't. I mean, think about how little you learn in just a year of being in the Army, and then you're let go. Like in Russia, for most people who don't realize, it's a year. Conscription is required of men between 18 and 27, I think, was the normal conscription for that. You did a year up until 2007. It was like 2 years. Then they reduced it to 18 months. And then in 2008, they pushed it down to 1 year because they wanted to reduce the military, save money. And so now that's what remains. These soldiers and conscripts that are on the normal reserve roster in Russia have 1 year of service. Sometimes they might be prior active that got out, conscripts, and they're now on the reserve rosters. But a lot of these are going to be non-contract conscripts that have up to a year of service. Then you have the BARS system, which they only started last year. They were trying to build a proper active reserve that was drilling, shooting, doing all that stuff.
BARS. Is that what you're saying?
BARS. Okay. Yeah, BARS. It's the Russian acronym for it. It's like
gotcha. Yeah.
Army. Yeah. But they only started building that last year, and the BARS system was supposed to raise about 100,000 troops ish. It did not come anywhere near that. There are 5 military districts throughout the Russian Federation. They were trying to raise roughly like a corps, I think, for each one, and they really got closer to like a brigade. They got maybe total around 30,000 troops so far. And this was started, keep in mind, like 4 months before the invasion. It was not a lot of time. So BARS was already kind of the first phase of this initial attempt of a mobilization in preparation for what was going to be the invasion. Then you had a second push after the invasion to try and replenish a lot of the cost in troops with another partial kind of undercover mobilization by purposely retaining contract troops who were supposed to be done with their contract. This was as early as like March and April.
Stop loss kind of.
Exactly, stop loss. And these were guys that were being held over, and they're like, wait, my contract says I'm done. The government's like, no, you're not. And they hold them over. They were also actively starting to pull and recall guys from their old school reserve. They're guys who had been contract soldiers who got out, and they were getting letters saying, hey, you need to come back. Then in like July, June, summer timeframe, to replenish more losses, they started implementing what were called the volunteer battalions. And you probably saw some of this. And what it was basically was the government, Putin's government basically said, hey, all these administrative regions, like they're called oblasts, but they're kind of like, I kind of describe them as like states or counties, but they basically told all their like state governments, hey, each one of you need to cough up a battalion of volunteers of up to about 400 troops.
Was that the Third Army, the Third Army Corps? Was that
that was going to
Third
form parts of the Third Army, yeah, of what would have been the Third Combined Arms Army, or Third Army Corps, yeah.
And so this is like a militia, raising a militia. then.
Not so much a militia. These were going to be regular uniformed Russian soldiers. They were just basically forcing the states to, with their own budgets and their own resources, get a bunch of people to volunteer and make a battalion. In at least each of these regions, they wanted each one to create at least one battalion. Now, some that were more, a little more excited, we'll say, created 2 or 3 battalions, like Chechnya and Ichkeria. Those places created a couple battalions of volunteers, but they were called volunteer battalions. Other ones created 1, and other counties created none, and were like, we don't have the means to do this. And that was part of the play to save money, was the government was putting all the onus on the local governments, on their funding, their money, their resources to form these battalions. Several of those battalions have since gone to the front. Some of them are still around, some of them have been decimated, some of them have been rotated out. And now we are at basically the 4th iteration of a kind of mobilization. And this is the first time they've actually out and out called it a mobilization. Interesting point. According to some BBC journalists I was listening to the other day, apparently the only reason we in the West are calling it a partial mobilization is because Putin has been calling it a partial mobilization for propaganda purposes. Apparently, on all the paperwork, the official documentation, there's nothing that makes this any different from a normal mobilization. All the paperwork just says mobilization on the government side.
I've heard that as well.
Side of Russia. It's they're saying partial, but within the legal framework in Russia, they can do it. They can mobilize everybody, but they didn't want to alarm people. But mission failed on that front because people are out and out protesting and getting into fights. And the other thing that I found interesting about this mobilization is if you look at maps of it too, and a lot of experts have been talking about this for several months now, the majority of the casualties from the war in Ukraine and a lot of the troops that have been mobilized, a lot of the casualties are actually coming from Far Eastern and minority republics. So part of that is intentional because about 75% of the country ethnically is like kind of white European, roughly. And Putin had always wanted to try and maintain. He wanted to make sure that the mobilization was mostly affecting republics outside of Moscow and the more European
country folk.
Yes. And he wanted to make sure it's basically, kind of like we're looking at a Vietnam-esque situation, like draft the poor. As long as you're ignoring the rich people and the school kids, no one's going to complain.
Or working class, for sure.
And that's why we've been seeing a lot of the protests to mobilization happening in these far-flung republic city centers out in way out in the Far East and in Siberia and other places like that, because that's where the majority of a lot of these casualties and people that have been drafted are coming from, is out in these far-flung republics, so that the people in the big cities aren't going to feel this mobilization. Mm-hmm. And the people that are going to complain are going to be out in the country and no one's going to listen to them, right? So it's this partial mobilization that started now is the first time that regular people are starting to see this. And I've even started to see this more directly in people like that I know of, and through secondhand knowledge of, I collect a lot of Russian stuff and Russian paraphernalia and military stuff. We're starting to see guys we know in Russia that that are sellers of and collectors of certain things. Like they're like, hey man, what all do you need shipped to you? Because I'm leaving the country next week. Like, or like people talking about queuing up and getting turned away. It's definitely not good. This is unlike anything that we've seen in recent memory. The fact that
In our lives, yeah.
yeah, oh, easily, yeah. And it's like even after Afghanistan in '89, like there was a lot of unrest because there were the mothers of all these soldiers that have been killed that were asking questions, and the government was. And honestly, I would say it's more restrictive now in the information sphere than it was in '89, 1990. At least Glasnost and Perestroika kind of opened up some things to the general public. But arguably, if you look at all the estimates of KIA, we're already well past the amount of people that died in Afghanistan in 9 years of fighting. So there's going to be a groundswell of people asking a lot of questions here if they aren't already. And things are definitely not. It's unlike anything we've seen in recent memory. That's for sure.
Like last week, Shoigu said that the defense minister, is that the right term? Okay, yeah. He said like 5,000 Russians had been killed in the war so far, as of last week. And like I know there's. Listen, I'm not going to ask you for a number, but holy cow, that is a sixth of what other sources are putting out.
Well, and here's the thing about that too. So that's the BBC's been doing a really good, good program where they have a woman and they have a whole team that basically since the beginning of the war has been tracking KIAs that they 100% no shit can confirm by graves registrations in Russia.
Okay.
Their current estimate, and these are like literally, it says, on a headstone somewhere in Russia, this soldier died in Ukraine. They've counted in the mid 5,000s. However, by their estimates, they estimate at least as much of that also have been buried uniformed service members who died in a combat zone since February 24th, but they don't explicitly say Ukraine. So we can pretty easily confer that around 12,000 or so can be no shit confirmed as KIA. And that's on the Russian side of things that we know.
I was gonna say that's not even touching LPR and DPR, right?
Right. And it's also not touching the fact that like outside of that, I've seen videos and I've heard accounts from Ukrainians of like the Russians are notorious for just abandoning ship. Like if they get into a tight tactical spot, they are beating feet and getting out of there. And you're leaving bodies in large groups. Like if you've got a platoon and you're just booking out of there, if you got 3 guys who get shot in the end of your tank and fall off into the road, they're not going back to pick them up. So my estimate in my mind, I'm thinking is like easily we're looking at somewhere like 20K KIA, and that's far more than
that is a lot.
That is a lot. That
since the spring.
For reference, just over 9 years in Afghanistan, they lost 15. So we're looking at more in 8 months, 7 months than they lost in 9 years of fighting in Afghanistan. And that alone, that many in that short of time itself can have effects on a population and society. Like I was talking to somebody about this at work the other day. Like there is no way in hell that would be tolerable in the United States. Like we lost 5,000 over 2 different fronts in 20 years, and we mourn that in its own way. But like, imagine having lost 5,000 people in a month, like, or 2 months. Jesus, like it's really hard to get people to wrap their heads around. And it always comes back to this for me too, especially when I'm talking to people about it at work. There is, and especially in my historic thing, historically, I think part of it is the Russians have this tolerance because they've been through such atrocious wars and such terrible conflicts of attrition that they could just eat up these casualties and people to a degree accept it because of their shared experience with World War II and the huge institutional trauma that World War II was to their society. And it's also really easy for us here in the West to get wrapped around the axle, knowing what we do about World War II, having the obsession and the cultural obsession with World War II that we do as well, and World War I and past conflicts, and thinking it's very easy for us to brush off, as sad as it sounds, 15,000, 20,000 people killed in a conflict in the modern era. And that's to say nothing of the civilian suffering. And, we don't talk a whole lot about all the people that were killed as far as civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's very easy for us to sweep these huge numbers under the rug that in the modern context are massive, but in the context of a global war like World War II, we think, that's nothing. There are more people were lost in one field in Ukraine in 1943 in a massive offensive, out of one army. But the effects of this in a modern day context, in a modern army, in a modern society with social media, the ability to talk is monumental. And I think we're going to see some major shifts here at some point. I don't want to say when or how, but something has to give. It just seems insane to me.
As in the casualties are too much. Something has to change in the sense of less combat versus more.
Societally, I think there's something is going to have to give in terms of the government. The soldiers that are coming back have morale through the freaking floor. Like, I don't know if you read, Sarah, I don't know if you saw this when it came out. And I think, Preston, you might have done a TikTok on it at one point, but it was back in like August, I think. He's now pretty well known. His name's Pavel is his first name, but there was a Russian airborne soldier who was wounded and went back to the rear for treatment after 2 months of fighting from the day of the invasion until about April. He went to the hospital. He wrote a massive, like 140-page long post on VKontakte, which is Russia's like Facebook. He stayed in Russia for a while, but then he started making the rounds on media and talking to people. And he came out he wrote this like long account of his experience he called Zov, which is basically it's like saying Z, like the symbol they put on everything. But he wrote this big thesis about his experience and how he's very anti-war and morale is through the floor, and none of the units were, full of it. It's been very damning on the part of the Russian military. And unfortunately, no one's fully translated the whole thing into English. But I recently found a machine translation, which was rough, but it gets the concept across.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, a whole bunch of Western media outlets reported that when this came out, and he's since fled Russia.
That was my question, but he wrote it from Russia, an injured soldier. I'll call him war hero, right? In normal terms, a war hero in this hospital bed at home in Russia, going on a massive anti-government long rant. Very long that rant. He publishes on social media. That's from Russia. And now you're talking, I'm trying to maybe push out some optimism to think about, and then you're talking now, we don't know the future, but your sort of hypothesis now is something's got to give in the sense that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and this killing has got to stop at some point. It's not going to work. Man, I just feel like this is progress, right? The 29 million or however so that did die in World War II and ours that died. And I know you said their generational trauma, but I think it's our generational trauma. I think we all felt it as societies. I don't think my opinion is it's not right to just put it on them. I think we're suffering from it now in ways that we don't know, because maybe we were too arrogant to reflect upon it. And I think we're paying for that now here in America. But anyway, all of this death, these unnamed islands in the Pacific that we talk about with these Marines that are just islands in the middle of nowhere, but just the fighting and the death that was upon those areas, and the generational trauma that if this is the new form of war, or I guess this is war versus what we did was conflict. Maybe that's the difference. This is war. We did conflicts. But either way, if something has to give, because the people, the working class, those that don't actually have the power, because all of our governments are run by the few. That's the commonality, regardless of whatever the mode of government is. To me, that does sound like progress, right? Towards something better. I don't know what that is. I don't think it's worse, maybe is my point.
And I've talked to a couple people about this too. I think that what's happening now is going to be, so if you think about it, there's been some other conflicts, Chechnya and other stuff like that have been happening, but there hasn't been anything large and generational that's happened in the post-Soviet Russian Federation. If you're in military circles, of course, they're generational, but I think the scale of this conflict is going to have a generational impact, unlike any that we've seen since Afghanistan, if not before. That's what's different about this conflict. Chechnya was happening, on TV for us, but was kind of being ignored over in Russia. Bodies were coming home in zinc coffins and people were asking why, but it wasn't, a huge portion of the population. Georgia happened. It was only 8 days. The war was over. Syria has happened, but again, conflict, right? That's your counterinsurgency. It's your low boil kind of happening in the background thing. But this is now at the point where it can't be ignored. And that's what I think is very, very different here, especially.
Have you read Zinky Boys?
I sure have, man.
Yeah.
Do not have any depressants in your system while you're reading that.
I recommend everybody read that if you're watching. This is not it, but it's like this big of a book, right? Is that fair?
I have
Not a big book.
Probably a little thicker than that even.
Not bad.
It is. I really enjoy the parallels between Afghanistan and Vietnam in that book. It is a great book for understanding the Russian psyche in a conflict, especially with Afghanistan. And there's a lot of, I'm sure we will see even more comparisons between Afghanistan and this.
Yeah.
But you're going to have an even larger proportion of people. And the other thing about Afghanistan, I want people to know, is that when you look at Afghanistan was fought over 9 years with just conscripts. Like, they were just able to continue to do that war for 9 years with their standard 2-year conscripts that were coming through, doing their fighting and coming home. The fact that they had to reach so deep to get the forces they need to fight this war this is the first time they've done a mobilization of this scale since World War II. They did not have to mobilize to fight in Afghanistan. And that was part of how the government could keep it going as long as they did in Afghanistan, was they didn't have to mobilize. They just had conscripts like any normal day. There's millions of soldiers in the Soviet army at that time. You had a 50-50 chance of going to Afghanistan. Maybe you didn't. I know lots of guys who served their 2 years during the period of Afghanistan and Soviet Union and just didn't go. It was easy to ignore.
Interesting.
Also, they actively ignored it in the media and stuff, and they made sure that people didn't hear about it.
Right.
This one's a bit different.
Different government, though. Hey, it's a different government.
Yep.
And
different government, different media access, different. A lot of things that
I think is maybe it's progress, is what I'm saying. Even if it's a despot leading who has the sycophants who are afraid of saying something adverse to his opinion, all that still exists. But it sounds like at least the people have some sort of disruptive measures in place, more so maybe than they have in the past, because I just feel like there's still a new government, even if they had 400 years basically of czars, kings and peasants. And then that got overturned at the end of World War I by communism. And that lasted for 60 years, not even 80, because it's been 80 since World War II. So like 60 years,
70.
So 2 generations or something. And now we're in this new, well, I don't know what you call what they are now, dictatorship, but elected sort of Saddam Hussein-like maybe, because they have a bureaucracy, they've got government.
My favorite phrase is, I've gotten a little tired of the phrase, history is, you're bound to repeat it if you ignore it. The phrase I really enjoy, because I think it's a bit more accurate, is, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I really like that.
Oh yeah,
phrase, because history is never exactly the same, right? Like there's never going to be another Stalin. There's never going to be another Hitler, but there will be people that do things very similarly.
Hitler-like,
right? Yeah. And, Hitler adjacent, if you will, and like what's happening right now has so many echoes of the Stalinist period, because you're seeing this guy at the top who every time he fails, he just purges people below him, which keeps him in the clear and puts all the blame on them and gets rid of them. And you're already seeing that now. They're taking pages right out of the Stalinist playbook, just like, his generals in the early phase of Barbarossa and stuff. Get rid of the early guys. And they coincidentally also, by sacking them, you're getting rid of people that could otherwise be, your potential, enemy in the future and a political rival. You know, and we're seeing that right now. They're going through commanders of combined armies out in Ukraine like crazy right now. They haven't had as many get offed recently, but they're definitely going through commanders. And they're very quick to always blame the commander of whatever region of whatever army is in control of whatever front. They're very quick to do that. And they like to do that because it keeps all the blame off Putin, despite the fact that all things seem to point to him having a lot more control over everything. And the more he sacks commanders, the more control he has, which is going to just further this strange thing that he's hitched his wagon to, I guess. But yeah, I highly recommend looking up that Zov write up from Pavel. It's a good write, and it's interesting. It goes to show just how secretive they had to be about this war, that most of the soldiers going into it had no idea what they were doing, and had no idea what they were getting into, or were even equipped to do so. And it's not just this guy's account. I've read similar accounts from other Russians. And don't get me wrong, the Ukrainians are having their own supply issues, but I think what we're seeing now is certainly the result of our hard-earned taxpayer dollars and 47,000 odd metric tons of equipment and crap that we sent them. It doesn't hurt that we've been bankrolling them essentially since day one, and we're starting to finally see the kind of results of that. I think that's part of why the Kharkiv offensive was so successful. And I read recently that apparently the reason that Kharkiv went the way it did initially, the Ukrainians, for a lot of reasons, have been very focused on getting back Kherson, because Kherson down in the south is the largest city that the Russians hold. And it bothers me when they always say it's the only major city. Like, there are tons of other cities in the southern coast and around Kherson and around Kharkiv that they've taken, and I guess we're just ignoring all those. Like, I understand that Mariupol was destroyed, but like, it's still a major city and they hold it. And like, are we just going to ignore that they have most of that coastline? But anyway, but apparently recently there's been a big step up in sharing of tactical information between us and the Ukrainians. And in fact, it sounds like we have pretty much our own like battle staff set up, where the Ukrainians feed us all sorts of tactical information. We give them like live feedback on like what they're wanting to do in tactical situations. And the reason Kharkiv went off so well was initially the Ukrainians really wanted to do just a massive offensive in the south to retake Kherson city. And we said, that's probably not a good idea, man. Like, you're going to be putting all your eggs in one basket. It's just going to be, you know, a meat grinder. Don't do that. However, what if we split your forces? We put a whole bunch we go radio silence, make it sound as though it's all going to be preparatory for a big offensive in the south, and then you guys sweep through the north. And apparently that came from us through tactical, you know, guidance, and through people that have been advising the Ukrainians. So apparently that was a big part of it. And you know what? Mission accomplished, because no one saw a massive offensive happening in the north. I sure as hell did. So they did a good job, whatever they were doing.
On that note, any predictions, we'll wrap it up with this. Any predictions are risky. Predictions in war even more so. So I'll give you the out. You can say pass, but any predictions that you have on your mind, we'll say the next 3 to 6 months.
3 to 6 months. I honestly don't think, other than, you know, some small incremental gains here and there, the Ukrainians have burnt themselves out in Kharkiv. They've only got so much stuff and so many people, right? At the end of the day, the Ukrainians have been fully mobilized since February. The Russians are not. However, the Ukrainians are far more motivated, but they get burnt out too. They need to rest and recuperate and refit. I think we're going to maybe see some more small incremental gains. We're kind of seeing that around Kherson in the south. But the Russians are going to take a long time to get any new troops out there. And even then, it seems like going forward, the training and the combat capability of the troops that the Russians are going to be dumping into this front are going to be questionable at best. Motivation is going to be low. So I don't foresee there being any major pushes. I could maybe see the Russians trying to throw everybody off kilter by starting some sort of offensive in the dead of winter. They like to do that sometimes, and I can see them tactically doing that. just to try to throw everybody off, because the Western media has been very quick to go, oh, we got to do everything before the winter sets in, before, everything's mush. Well, it may be snow, but frozen ground is a lot easier to go over than, spring ground out there. So I could see them trying to push for some sort of offensive in the winter, but I think it's going to
plenty of battles in that part of the world in the dead of winter. Yeah.
And those people that fight those battles, it's not like one side is used to it and the other not. They both sort of
They know
used to
know how to
terrain
fight.
and weather.
They
both
live
sides. That's the scary part, I guess.
Yeah, and so I don't know if they're going to try and do anything major through the winter, but I do feel for sure it's going to take a while for the Russians to mobilize anything major from what they've got. The best they can do is in the next few months get their mobilized units trained, put them into some units, and probably place them in defensive positions so they've at least got something to fall back on, and then maybe send their more capable units forward. Because from what I've been reading, what's weird is that the National Militia, the DNR and LNR guys, they've actually been some of the more combat capable units now that a lot of them disintegrated up in the north. The LDNR guys and the LDNR Special Forces have been some of the more tactically proficient guys out there. And I think that comes from two things. One, they've been fighting for a while. A lot of those guys have been in the conflict for 8 years, so they're experienced. In addition to that, though, they have a vested interest in doing well because those guys can't go anywhere. Some of them, I've read some reports where the LDNR people are trying to flee back into Russia proper, and they're not being allowed, even with their new issued passports. But also, if you think about it, those guys have a vested interest in fighting because they're from that area and they don't want to lose and be occupied by the Ukrainians and then be sought out because they were fighting for the wrong side. Yeah. So if anything, they're probably fighting the most because all the regular Russian soldiers can just be like, screw this, I'm going back to Magnitogorsk and living out my life on a farm. These guys don't have anywhere to go. So, but yeah, from what I've seen, weirdly enough, the tables have kind of shifted from the LDNR guys being a lot of the more combat capable ones. But I don't think we're going to see anything major like we did see with Kharkiv up in the north there. But I've been wrong before. So
well, and then I have to ask. Look, I get a question. I have to ask because I get asked all the time. And this is a guess. This is a theory. No one's holding you accountable to this. Like, what are your thoughts on tactical nukes or nukes of any form?
Oh boy. So
I know it's late, but I gotta.
I'd like to say that Putin is smart. However, he seems to be backed up in a corner. I have gotten more concerned now that they've done they've started the referendum. More than likely, these are going to finish out tomorrow. And by the end of I wouldn't be shocked if by the end of this week, Putin signs in that the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the southern coast, I don't want people to forget about that, i.e. Mariupol, all the way over to Kherson, they're probably going to sign in and claim as Russian territory. Whether the rest of the world sees that as Russian or not, which most of them won't, Russia will see those as Russian. That, and what scares me about that is that Russia will then, in their minds, have a legal reason for claiming ironically, Ukrainian aggression against Russian lands that they took aggressively from Ukraine 6 months ago. The claims they can make after that point. And the thing is up to this point, Russia has not declared war against Ukraine. I want everybody to remember that. There is no official state of war existing between Russia and Ukraine. There are a lot of things that happen internationally, diplomatically, legally speaking, if they declare war against Ukraine. If that becomes the case, that could open the table to a lot of other things. That may also be why legally, internally, they haven't ever claimed to be fully mobilizing, because it may be, I haven't studied their legal side of things, but it could be that within Russia, they have to have declared war against another state to implement full mobilization. But the secondary effects of them claiming those lands as their own, and then Ukrainians fighting to recapture them, and what the Russians decide to do after that, that's what bothers me. I could see what I've heard a couple people talk about, and this makes more sense to me, is I could see Russia like maybe doing a nuclear detonation, a test somewhere, like out in the Arctic Circle where they used to do it, or down in like one of the Asiatic stands where they
show a force.
Yep,
it's like a low flyover. Yeah,
I could see them doing that and being like, "Hey, look, we mean business. We're just they work. And the
And
thing
we
is,
got them.
your standard small yield nuclear weapons that they have on medium range ICBMs, and I think they can use them in artillery at some point too. Hiroshima, for reference, sits around, I think it's sat around like 10 megatons, something like that. Most of these low yield tactical nukes that they could use sit anywhere from 2 to 20. So you're looking at minimum Hiroshima, Nagasaki used in a area in Ukraine, if that were to happen. I like to try and believe, and I try to sleep at night knowing they won't do that. But again, I've been wrong before, and Putin seems increasingly desperate, and he doesn't seem to be heeding the calls of some people and bothered by public outcry much. So who knows? But I think it would be an escalation of force thing where they do one or two tests or something and try to show everybody they mean business before they actually did anything on the ground proper. But if they got desperate enough, they could drop one smack in the middle of Ukraine and just call it a day. Who knows?
I'm going to steal that response. I like it because it's very commonsensical, but who knows, right? Who knows?
Who knows? This conflict seems to be denying common sense in a lot of cases. So,
well, as always, appreciate you walking through a bunch of the stuff. Ian, always fun to talk about, and yeah, love what you're doing. Kind of sharing this with the next generation. Feels weird saying next generation. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but yeah, keep doing that thing.
Anytime, man. I'm happy to be on, and I love talking about this stuff. It's fun.
Sounds good, buddy. Take care.
Thanks, Ian.